All right, guys, we're back
Hello.
for another week on our scenic route to Tone Town, and today is a conversation I feel like I get accused of bringing up too frequently, and people, I feel like it's one of these things that if you don't do it right, it can really be consequential to the overall sound of your rig. And when you do it right, it can be a beautiful thing that really helps you get the most out of everything that is on your rig. And it's kind of one of those things, it's like a foundation of a house. When your foundation is rotten, maybe you can't tell from the outside. Maybe you have a beautiful pedal board. Mm-hmm. But when you get into the actual plane of the pedal board, everything just falls apart. So it's a thing that sometimes people don't want to spend money on. It's not sexy like a kitchen remodel or bathroom remodel. It's kind of the thing that holds everything together, the foundation, So if you haven't guessed it, it's none other than the buffer. And I think today what would be helpful to people who are out there in YouTube land or in podcast land is maybe for us to break down buffering scenarios, how you would want to buffer, how many buffers, the right types of buffers that you would use for maybe the most common signal paths, whether that be a mono rig, 1 amp, whether that be a stereo rig, 2 amps, a wet dry or wet dry wet rig, a 4 cable method or 5 cable method, meaning you're using amplifiers with an effects loop or stereo amps with an effects loop. And maybe also talk about some contingencies, like if you have a wireless unit, or if you have active pickups, or if you have some sort of impedance-sensitive pedals, and we've mentioned this a little bit before, like fuzzes or treble boosters or vintage wahs or things that wouldn't be compatible with a buffer up front. So before we dive into maybe these different things, is there any sort of like generalities that we should kind of, or broad strokes, that clarification points that we should use as far as vocabulary, things that people are going to hear as things come up, that we kind of want to give like a little bit of a disclaimer or trigger warning on for the people that are triggered by buffers? Because I have a trigger warning once we've gone through you guys, because there's definitely people that are buffer apologists that we need to address.
Interesting.
I think the only thing I'd say is that, this people may disagree with me right off the bat, but buffers are not bad, and buffers will, in a typical rig, will really, which is the whole point of this episode, I understand, but they're going to help you out if used responsibly, just like all the key things in life, like the kitchen remodel. Do it responsibly. You'll be glad you did.
Don't use asbestos.
Exactly. That's a material we've moved past for great reasons. And I think like the whole true bypass debate, we've moved past it, and we'll talk about it today for good reasons. And again, in a typical rig, a buffer is going to be probably your best friend, I would say, on your pedal board. A buffer is really going to hold your hand and get you well on the way to Tone Town.
It's buffer's your wingman.
Yeah.
I think
it's goose.
Buffers are
since we're in the Top Gun, reloaded era.
Yeah,
never leave your wingman.
That'd be my only thing. Yeah, exactly.
Never leave your wingman.
Yeah, learn from Maverick's mistakes.
Yeah.
Anything from you, Brian? Any buffer kind of disclaimers at the top?
I'm gonna say the same thing that you had just said. You honestly took the words out of my mouth. Just because there's so many people that are like, I don't want a buffer. I'm like, well, why? They're like, just, because they gave me these reasons. I'm like, okay, well, those aren't bad reasons to have it. Like, there's a purpose for them. And I think it's mostly just a misunderstanding. So yeah, let's do this.
Yeah. The disclaimer that I want to make, and I want you to just raise your hand if this person sounds familiar. And if you're listening or watching right now in the car or wherever you can raise your hand too, if you've heard of this person, or maybe this person's you. Let's just call this person Scott for now.
Okay, sorry, Scott.
So and you know who you are, Scott. So Scott says, well, I hate buffers. They wreck my tone. Therefore, I leave my RC booster always on.
Mm-hmm.
As if somehow that absolves the buffer from being present. Well, here's a pro tip, guys. Any pedal that's on is a buffer, whether it's true bypass or not. So
Cue
Scott
music.
thinks he doesn't have a buffer because he's got his RC booster always on, because buffers wreck his tone. Somehow anything under the buffer umbrella wrecks his tone. Yet he doesn't realize that once his pedal is on, whether it's an RC booster or whatever the pedal might be, that's actually a buffer. Sorry to tell you. And the specs on an RC booster, maybe not the best for a buffer, but still within the range of what we would consider to be buffers, probably around the spec of a Boss buffer, maybe like a 1K output impedance, maybe a 470 to 500K input impedance, a little more loaded down. But he actually does like a buffer. He just doesn't know it. And so a lot of us think that we've like gamed the system somehow by like turning on a pedal and you know, we don't have a buffer anymore because I use pedal X always on and that resolves all my tone suck. Well, those are still buffers. And I think the other disclaimer to name is that just because you have a buffer doesn't mean it's a good one. So there's some people that say, well, I have pedal X, so I don't need a buffer because that is a buffer. And I think it's making the same mistake in logic as saying, I have an overdrive, therefore I don't need a clon, because all overdrives are clones. Just because it's under the category of overdrive doesn't mean it's a clone. There can be hundreds of different variations of an overdrive that are dissimilar from a clone, just as there can be hundreds of different variations of a buffer. So I would say that buffers are like Michael Keaton in Batman, the original Batman. Well, I shouldn't say the original Batman, but the Batman of the 90s, where once he played Batman, he was typecast as Batman. And bad buffers have become typecast, and people think that because they've had a bad experience with an inferior buffer, that is indicative of all buffers being bad. And the truth is that of all the buffers that are out there, I'd say fewer than 5% of them are actually good at what they do and are actually designed by people that understand pedal boards and rigs and the principles behind them. It's not just like a Me Too product where people are like, oh, I'll make one of those as well. Like I already have 20 other pedals in my lineup and let's just add a buffer, you know. And I guess Me Too is the wrong word for this because it's a different thing.
It's a
but
loaded
let's just
statement.
say,
Yep.
let's just say it's a product that people will just add on to their line so that they can kind of fill out a product line so that they kind of offer something for everybody in their product line. And it's not necessarily something that is maybe well thought out or that it's a really well-built version of the product. Like when you buy a Goodwood audio interfacer, let's say, you're buying a product that is specifically designed by somebody who is building hundreds of pedal boards every year, that is explicitly designed for the purpose of multi-amp setups, stereo setups, wet, dry, wet setups. The buffers are optimized for a specific purpose. They're optimized based on somebody who has experience integrating 10 to 20 dissimilar pedals and getting them to speak the same language on a pedal board. High quality buffers do that without changing the fundamental essence of what's there. And if you just go and buy whatever buffer because you've heard this brand is good or this brand is reputable, I can tell you that pedal builders are not pedal board builders, and they don't have the same understandings of how to integrate pedals. They often are designing things one at a time, and they're not thinking about the 10 pedals that are going to come after it or the 10 pedals that come before whatever that particular device is. So I'm just going to give that as a disclaimer that not all buffers are created equally, and you think you're bypassing your issue by putting in a pedal always on. Let me tell you, that's also a buffer. So
Yeah.
gotcha. Buffer wins again.
Do it.
So maybe let's, if there is there anything more that we want to add to sort of like a preamble here to getting into maybe some of the buffering sort of methodologies for various signal paths?
I would just say one thing super quick, and that is basically if we go to the other side of the spectrum. So one side is, let's say, pro buffer. The other side is true bypass is king. Just humor me if you're listening and you're just thinking, I still don't believe you, Mason. True bypass is still better. Just go home, plug in a 20-foot cable from your guitar to your amp, and then plug in, it doesn't even have to be a good one for this test, any buffer you have at home in between your guitar and amp, you will notice a stark difference, even if it's a low quality buffer. And a good quality buffer will obviously do even more for you. But for the sake of a simple test, just give it a shot. Your guitar will come to life. And in the words of Brian from a previous week, talking about the UA amp and cab sims, you were saying it's like taking a blanket off of your amp. And it's the same thing. Once you start getting into buffers, it's like, there's your tone. You just
your amp is going to go topless.
Exactly. Thank you. First Michael Keaton, topless amps. I mean, you've got them all today, Mason. So yeah, I would say just do the test yourself. With everything on the podcast, and from my opinion, don't take our word for it. Take our instruction and then go and do your own tests and make up your own mind. Do the same with buffers. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised if you're on the true bypass side of things.
And I think that and you can't overdo it on buffers, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the weeds on this stuff, but I think, certainly if you have a bigger rig, there's a place for true bypass, and we'll get into it. But I think there's also a place for good buffers. And maybe we'll also talk a little bit about pedals that already have great buffers involved, where it doesn't necessitate, say, an external box like a Goodwood audio interface or the Vertex buffer interface, let's say. But maybe let's start by talking about a good old mono rig, the approach to buffering it properly. So when we say mono rig, we mean guitar, series of pedals or pedals in a switcher, whatever it might be, going into the front of an amp. Standardized mono rig. Our approaches to that. How would we do it? Who wants to start?
Go on, Brian.
I would say my typical approach would be a buffer in. Most of the time I utilize some kind of interface that has a buffer. There's a couple times where I've installed a buffer. I'm trying to think of the company. I want to say I think it was Free to Tone. They have an input output junction box that has two buffers, so one input, one output.
It's the Musicom Lab.
The Musicom, thank you. I could not remember who it was. So we sell their stuff. Great. They're awesome. So I actually installed one on Mark Lettieri's current board, and he was like, I don't know, like what is it? And I explained. I was like, well, it's an input and output buffer. I was like, you use it at your discretion if you feel like you hear a difference. And I think he told me that he messed with it, and he's like, it was a while ago, but he's like, oh yeah, I utilized the input of it because I noticed how much of a difference it made. So I'll install some of those on boards sometimes, but yeah, it's typically like a first buffer, and depending on how much cabling, like I did one board that had like 18 Boss pedals on it. I put a couple buffers in there. But yeah, it's mostly that first in signal that's not, get back anything from your 20-something foot cable that some of them like to use.
Do you ever say, Brian, like, I did this board, it had 20 Boss pedals on it, but really it's your personal board? Was that your board you're talking about?
No, it wasn't.
Okay,
it was
shame board. This is a shame board.
It's for Nickelback covers, and that's his personal board that he uses. Doesn't tell anyone about it.
If I had a board with 20 Boss pedals on it, it would be like all like DD7s and RV5s or something like that.
And a couple metal zones.
By the way, Nickelback, I just have a quick aside about them. They keep printing their set list out on our showroom printer. So whoever the tour manager is, stop using our paper. We've had like 20 Nickelback set lists printed out on our, because it's like connected to like the entire like complex, like the rehearsal complexes.
Oh my gosh.
Wi-Fi. And so
Beautiful.
We've had like Doobie Brothers set lists. We've had Fleetwood Mac set lists. We've had
and he just keeps hitting print, won't come out on his printer.
Yeah. So we have like 20 of them where it's just like every song, the tuning, the guitar.
Oh my gosh. That's amazing.
Yeah. All right,
But that's what I would say. No, I like that. So yeah, that's what I would say for me.
I'd probably do the same. I'd probably just say the only addition is if and not. I mean, a lot of guys for boards that we build don't necessarily have buffer sensitive pedals at the beginning, but that would probably be the only change is if they do have vintage fuzz or whatever it is, put the buffer after that, then move into the rest of your series signal chain, and then general rule of thumb, we'll put one at the end as well, right before the send out of the board to the amp input.
Yeah. And I would agree with that. I think that the rule is pending that you don't have a fuzz, and then the only thing it would change is the fuzz would just come before the input buffer. You have an input buffer first that the guitar hits immediately. The reason for that is that we're trying to load the guitar pickups to believe as though they're seeing the input of an amp. So loading them appropriately, and for most guitar amps, it's a 1 meg input impedance. Almost every amp is that. And then as low output impedance as possible, preferably, and I always say as close to 100 ohms. The closer to 0, the better, but reasonably 100 ohms is good. I would say no higher than 500 ohms. And that's on the output impedance. So input and output impedance are for one buffer. Every pedal has an input impedance and an output impedance within the walls of the pedal, right? So I'm not talking about two different units yet. So input buffer, guitar comes in, it's loaded, so the guitar pickups react as though they're plugged into an amplifier. You're simulating that by way of whatever it is that you set the input impedance as. Hopefully that's 1 meg. Then output impedance, very low. And really, I think the easiest way to think about impedance, if that word sounds unfamiliar to you or confusing, I would just say when we're using this word, you're basically just thinking of like, how sensitive is it? If it's high impedance, it means it's really sensitive to everything. If it's low impedance, it means it's not that sensitive to anything. So when you convert to low impedance on the output of the input buffer, so the jack that goes out to the pedals, that means that it's sending the pedals a signal that is not particularly sensitive. So as pedals get turned on and off, you're going to have a fairly consistent output impedance that's going to be driving through all the pedals. So the variability from pedal 1 to pedal 6 or pedal 10 or pedal 11 are going to be somewhat mitigated. And it's important to also have a buffer last because we don't know the quality of the input and output impedances of any given pedal on the pedal board. There's no standard for guitar pedals. Some of them could be as low as, let's say, 100K or even lower than that. Some of the output impedances could be 10K or higher. There's all sorts of variability that it can't be accounted for unless you're Pete Cornish and he buffers between every single pedal on his kind of like, custom-made pedal boards because he's trying to control for all those variabilities between pedals. But ideally, input buffer first, output buffer last, because again, you don't know what's going to be on the pedal board. The output buffer is just ensuring that no matter what pedals are on, that you always have a consistent low impedance line being driven back to the amplifier, and that it's not going to affect any of the overall sound. What you've built and designed on the actual pedal board itself is going to make it all the way to the amplifier. So yeah. I think that's something that's super important that you have to account for when you're building your rig. No questions asked.
Can I interrupt for 1 sec and just say, let's say I'm Scott, our character from before who's anti-buffer. I'm starting to come around, and I bought a single buffer, 1 input, 1 output jack. That's all I have. You haven't sold me on the output buffer or the input buffer. I just have 1. What is the best place to put 1 buffer, if I have it, in my series rig? I'm not getting 2 yet. I just have the 1. The typical rig, where should I put it?
Brian, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, so I would say there's a couple different decisions. It depends if you have a volume pedal. I personally would say if you have a volume pedal, depending on that volume pedal, if you're noticing it in or out of the circuit, if it's taking some of your tone away, you could throw it before, you could throw it after to recoup some of that. If you don't notice a difference and say you have like one of the higher end volume pedals, that wouldn't be the issue. It's more of testing where you think you're losing, if you feel like you're losing it, and where you could benefit from it. So it's placing in the beginning, plugging it in, playing, taking it out, putting it at the end, playing, and it kind of it's all gear and our tones, and I've realized this over the years, it's all really just personal choice. Like, really, when it comes down to it, as much as we can tell you do this, do that, like I met a guy who ran his reverb first in the very front of his chain, and I was like so confused. I was like, why? And he's like, man, honestly, it sounds really good. And I was just like, okay. He goes, plus I like how the reverb hits the drives. I'm like, okay, that's fine. I know that's your choice, and the reason he ran it that way, it made sense for him. So I would say it's kind of shooting out those three. Like, how does it sound in the beginning? Am I gaining anything from it? How does it sound after volume? Is it helping restore any volume, like any tone loss? Because some volume pedals have tone loss, or is it more beneficial at the end? So those are my three kind of like when people ask me, and most switchers I install have an input, middle, and output buffer, and they'll notice a difference. So that's what I would say personally.
I would say for if you had to have one, it depends on this factor. Some people do, like Scott, the fictitious person Scott, yes, that we were talking about earlier. If you have an always on pedal that's first in the chain, then the input buffer in most cases will be negligible, especially if the specs of your pedal are already fairly similar to what a high quality input buffer would be, or let's say you have a good tuner that also has a buffer in it. So an example of like a good quality buffer in a tuner would be like that of the TC Electronic tuners that have the bona fide buffer in it. The bona fide buffer has a 1 meg input impedance and 100 ohm output impedance, which is ideal. If you already had that, then I wouldn't waste my one buffer that you would be adding to the board in that place, because you already have a good quality buffer up front. You could even make an argument for a lesser quality buffer like that of a Boss tuner to be up in front, because Boss tuners still do have a 1 meg input impedance, and although the output is kind of high for a buffer, 1K, you could make an argument that if you have a lot of pedals on after it, that the viability of the low output impedance is going to be somewhat nullified, because you're going to have stuff that's going to be interrupting that output impedance anyway in fairly short order. But you are getting the correct loading of the guitar, and in that case, I would put the buffer last. So I think it depends on what you have. By contrast, let's say you have a Strymon pedal that's last in your chain and always on. Strymon pedals have really great buffers already built into them that are that same spec: 1 meg input impedance, 100 ohm output impedance. So if you have a Flint always on, or a Big Sky always on, or an Iridium or whatever, there's no reason for you to use up your buffer as an output buffer, because your Strymon pedals already have that, and it's very high quality and already built in. So I'd, in that case, put my buffer right on the input in that case.
So again, speaking as Scott, you guys aren't giving me any black and white answers here. It's rig dependent.
It's definitely rig dependent, and I think you have to account for what, like if you were only going to put one buffer on there, you could only afford to put one buffer on there. It would be based on either what's always on or what already has a high quality buffer in it. And it's important to look up these specs. And I would say to you, anybody who is manufacturing a buffer or who is manufacturing a pedal that they purport has a buffer, I would say if they're not publishing those specs in their spec sheet, to me that's dubious for sure. Because if you're Volvo and you say you have a car that is the safest vehicle on the road, but you refuse to publish your crash test ratings, that would be the same as somebody saying we have an excellent transparent buffer and they don't publish the input and output impedance specs. If they're not publishing it, they either don't know that that's the target that they're trying to hit, or they're omitting them because they're not any good. Like there would be no reason for you not to publish that. That's like the X factor here.
Nice. Thank you,
Yeah,
Scott.
Yeah.
I appreciate the candid answers, and I'm going to switch back to being Grant again.
Do we want to
Welcome back,
move
Grant.
on to? Do we want to just maybe, because stereo rigs aren't really that much different? Do we want to add a quick aside for kind of how the mono rig might pivot slightly in a stereo rig context
Yes.
in terms of buffering?
Yeah,
wants
I'd
to
say,
take that?
like, let's say in the Strymon example, you have a big sky last in your chain, and you're happy with that buffer. You basically have now gone from, let's say, a simplified version. Guitar plugs into your board. You have a couple overdrives, one plugging into the next, into a Boss CE2 mono chorus pedal, into your Strymon timeline. Now you split to stereo. So now you're using the left input of the timeline, left and right output of the timeline into the big sky. Left and right output of the big sky, you can go to 2 different amps. And so now, because the big sky has a good buffer, or maybe you're going into some other patch bay that has good buffers in it, now you basically have turned your mono pedal board into a stereo rig, and you have buffers on the final left and right output. So now you're potentially running 3, in air quotes for those listening, 3 buffers. You're running the left and right output buffer and maybe a buffer on your input of the pedal board. And I think that would be, from my perspective, the main change from going from a mono to a stereo rig that is well buffered.
Yeah. I would agree. Yeah, completely.
Yeah, I think it's same approach to mono. You're just adding another buffer for the additional output because you have to have, both sides of the stereo output buffered, left and right. The only other thing I'd add is that higher quality professional grade buffers like the Goodwood audio interfacer or our Vertex buffers is that we add an ISO transformer typically for those stereo outputs, because it can be the case that both amps are not necessarily connected to the same ground. It could be that both amps are not in the same polarity with each other, which means that they'll be out of phase, which means that basically the speaker of one amp is going forward as the speaker in the other amp is going back. And so this creates a time delay that creates the out of phase effect, which you want to correct. And so having that phase or polarity switch in addition to the galvanic isolation that's provided by the isolation transformer, those are really critical for stereo rigs to ensure that they're quiet and to ensure that you're actually getting the best capabilities out of a multi-amp setup. If you had a split system where it was still mono going into the buffer, and I know that both your interfacer and ours does this, if you just have one input going, you can actually split out to 2 amps where it's still all in mono, but it's just going to 2 amps, kind of the John Mayer, Stevie Ray Vaughan approach. Those would only need 1 buffer in that case. You would only need a buffer on 1 output before the split, and then a high quality buffer should be able to drive that parallel loading of having the 2 outputs. But you would still want to have the isolation transformer in that case, or some high quality buffers will still put a separate buffer on each of them, but it's not required. You could do it with just 1 buffer before the input of your Y split. So just an aside on that, but stereo rigs is almost identical to the mono, other than you just need that additional output buffer for the second output.
Yeah, I did want to mention, and we talked about this earlier, if I can share my screen real quick.
Yeah, let me make sure that if you're watching here on YouTube, you'll be able to see Brian's amazing screen share.
Well,
and if you're just listening, then you're going to have to imagine it.
Let's build up this screen share a little bit more just to really drive it home. Like
I can't take credit. No, I can't take credit for this because I didn't even design it. Actually, you guys did, Grant. So
okay. Well, let's lower the expectations a little bit back down here. Let's bring it back to earth.
All right. We see the diagram, the interfacer.
Okay.
Yep, okay. Yep. So when I tell people, and if you're watching, you can see this because it's almost like that Office episode where it's like, all right, tell me as if I was 5 or as if I was 1, like having to explain how like certain wiring works. I'm a visual person, so if you're watching, you can see like with a fuzz in a buffer. I've had I think I literally had someone just text me. They're like, I got a buffer, but I also have a fuzz. Do I do the buffer then the fuzz, or how does that work? I'm confused. So there's a couple of different ways where like you would like and I utilize the interfacer a lot. I actually have some on the way, which are great. But like you go into your passive buffer, or your passive junction into the fuzz, and then out of the fuzz into a buffer. So you can utilize that in multiple ways if you are not using an interfacer or a junction box. You can plug straight into your fuzz and then out of your fuzz into a buffer, then hit the rest of your stuff. Anytime I have someone that asks this kind of like question, I have all of these diagrams saved from Grant because they're just perfect and they explain as simple as possible and you can see where everything is. If you go to Goodwood Audio's website under their interfacer, they have different diagrams. I think oops, it's freaking out a little on me. I think there might be a couple different wiring ways in which you can wire stuff, but this one just clearly shows you how you go passively into your fuzz and then you go out of your fuzz into your buffer. It just all around helps kind of visualize. I don't even know how to stop this. How to visualize what you need to do and how to accomplish things with and it to make sense, because it's the same thing with like pretty much anything you do. Like you're hesitant about it because you don't know about it. It's like me growing up, I didn't like certain foods and I said I didn't like the foods, but really I'd never tried those foods. And I was like, it's like my kids, hey, eat this. I don't like that. Have you ever tried it?
What were those foods? I'm curious.
Cheeseburgers, French fries,
it was
pop.
gooey duck.
Oh, totally. Oh yeah, eat this popsicle. I don't know. I've never had a pop. No,
It looks healthy.
It does. No, it's like, I mean, they like fruits and vegetables and everything, but you get that random like cauliflower or something, which I love cauliflower, or like cauliflower, rice, and chicken. I do a lot of that. And they're like, oh, I don't like that. And I'm like, fool, you've never tried this. Just try it. So it's the same thing when
the cauliflower is turned into rice, or it's cauliflower, rice.
Yes,
chicken.
it's three things. Sometimes I get cauliflower rice, like an actual, like that's what the rice is made
You're
of.
fancy,
But no,
man. You're a lot fancier than me, let's be honest.
They don't have that in Canada yet, do they?
No, it's Sears
I guess
Cheerios
not.
for dinner. Go to bed.
I love Cheerios. So it's the same thing. It's like it's the same. Like people are like, oh no, I don't like doing that. It's like, well, have you ever tried it? Oh no, okay. So it's that same method. So I just tell people like, if you're thinking about something, diagram like Google it. I literally Googled like buffer wiring diagram, and sometimes you'll get like schematics, but you'll sometimes get people that will actually have like they've written stuff out. So that was just, I wanted to visually show, if you're watching, that's how you would do something like that. Because me personally, I would be like driving to work super confused, trying to figure out like how does that go. So visually, that's what I would say.
And the other lesson to take away is, if you are going to Brian's house for dinner, if you don't like cauliflower or rice, pre-eat and show up and just stay for the company.
Just bring some like Uncrustables or something.
Yeah,
I'm always down for those.
Multiple lessons from that story, which I appreciate.
Well, that's the episode for. Just kidding.
And there we go.
Should we move on to maybe 4 cable and 5 cable method versions, which can kind of extend out?
Yep.
Who wants to start first with 4 and 5 cable, or should we define that first?
We should probably define.
Yeah,
it.
let's define it. I think that's a good thing to chat about.
So 4 cable method is kind of become the way that it's been known when you use an amplifier with an effects loop, because it requires 4 cables: a guitar coming into the pedal board, a cable going out of the pedal board to the front of the amp, the send from the effects loop, the send from the effects loop, and the return to the effects loop, making 4 total cables. That's why it's called 4 cable method. The only difference between 4 cable method and 5 cable method is that 5 cable method is if you have 2 amps that have effects loops, you need an additional cable to go to the return of the second stereo amp, as opposed to just the 4 cables into a mono amp. So with that said, who would like to talk about buffering on a 4 cable method and 5 cable method amp setup?
I'll start us off quickly and then see where we go. But basically, I think the initial input section of the pedal board, so guitar coming into the pedal board, won't really change. You still need to think of buffer sensitive pedals. You probably still want to put a buffer as close to the beginning of your rig as possible. And where things really start to diverge is when you get past your dry pedals or your last overdrive. Maybe it's a boost, maybe it's a volume, which I know we've talked about that in previous episodes, where to put the volume. And then that's where you leave the pedal board for the first time, and where I would typically, as a general rule, put my second buffer. I'd put it before the signal leaves the board and heads to the amp input. So now there's a buffer, then amp input, effects send of the amp comes back to the pedal board, and you typically hit your modulation or wet effects. This is where this is a personal choice, would put my volume. I'd put it after the effects send of the amp, because I look at the amp preamp as kind of, I treat it in essence, as far as signal chain goes, as another overdrive, because I'll typically push it. That's where the amp channel switching comes in, all that. And then often I would put another buffer there if needed. Let's say it has a passive effects loop potentially. But I think that's, again, maybe my opinion, less important than the buffer that is sending to the amp input. Go through all the wet effects in mono, and then leave the pedal board again, buffer it, and then back to effects send.
Effects return.
Sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Effects return. The one other note I just really quickly touch on is that I get asked about consistently is customers asking, I have 2 amps with effects loops. I want to run them both in their entirety. So they want to go last dry effect to both amp inputs, both effects sends coming back to the board, 2 signals left and right leaving to go effects return to both amps. And wherever possible, I try and discourage people from doing this, because it's an isolation nightmare. And another approach would be just use 1 amp's preamp. So one send to the amp input of amp number 1, let's call it. Effects send from amp number 1, go stereo through the rig, buffer the left and right outputs, effects return of amp number 1, and then amp number 2 now gets its first introduction to the signal on its effects return. So you're only using the power amp of amp
stereo
2.
power amps, but mono
Correct.
preamps. And I'll say that this too about that is that, especially if you're using a channel switching amp, you can't effectively use both channels if you're running the stereo amp, because you have to then have 2 separate foot switches. As far as I know, most of the switchers don't have the ability to be able to have 2 different foot switch inputs at the same time, where it can switch both channels of both amps at the same time.
Unless you have a PBC 10
and there's
or
really
something.
there's really no value, in my opinion, in doing that. And you really are best off, again, having a single preamp and then a double power amp, especially if it's the same amp.
Yeah.
So that's how I would do it. I don't know what you guys disagree with me. I love it when it gets spicy in here. So please throw a wrench in here.
Well, I had actually someone a while ago want to do that exact, a double preamp, a whole effects loop, and I instantly emailed you, Grant, about a junction box, which I think you ended up doing. But the box was beautiful. It had everything the dude wanted, but it was the whole wiring up process of everything, and like mentally visualizing literally everything that was going on was so crazy. And the guy was like, I also want to incorporate my HX Stomp to do literally the exact same thing. And I was like, so wait, you want it wired through your HX Stomp and also your amps, and be able to switch if you're using your HX Stomp direct with that same double effects loop or 2 amp. It got so crazy where the guy was like, I just want all the options, and it became option overload. And I've only ever done one of those. I've been doing this for 7 or 8 years, and I've only had one person ever do that. I'll get 5 cable method, but it's like how Andy runs his, where that
Yeah.
5th cable goes to the return. Like that's the
That's the
most complicated.
standard.
That's standard. And it honestly, when he was one of the first people that ever did, whoever asked me to really do something like that, because I never really, the most I ever did was stereo wiring. So hearing 5 cable method, I'm like, what the heck is 5 cable method? So then when he explained it, he goes, oh, well, it's this. And I'm like, oh, well, that's simple. But yeah, no, I don't do double effects loops.
Well, and I think that people who are doing that, they can't have possibly have tried it, because they would have such a noise issue, an isolation issue, as Grant pointed out, if they actually try to implement it themselves at home. And there's not a net benefit once you've wired that up anyway.
Yeah.
It's just not a desirable way to do it. And frankly, the 5 cable method is, I think, as close to what a wet, dry, wet rig would have been had the pedals that exist now have existed in the 80s. Because really what they were trying to do is just run stereo rigs, and they had a single preamp source, they had a stereo power amp, and in a lot of the early wet, dry, wet rigs, they didn't have a dry cabinet on stage anyway. It was just a load. And then they would push the dry signal through the wet effects. And so I think that if you really want sort of the ease of a stereo rig with some of the benefits and original sort of intents behind a wet, dry, wet rig, running 5 cable method is probably the simplest way to get there. You're still getting all of your wet processing after the preamp. You still have a stereo rig. You still have great separation of the wet effects post your distortion effects, and I think that that's a good way to do it. Now, I as far as Grant's buffering, I would say I'm pretty much in alignment with exactly with what he said. The only difference I would make, and it's not necessarily anything that Grant said, but effects loops are like pedals in that there are no standards either, and so there is no standardized output. So some of it could be, +4. Some of it could be -20 on the output. And some of them have controls that help you adjust whatever that output level is. Some of them are just wide open. Some of them are buffered. Some of them are not. And because there's no consistency in effects loops, it makes it difficult to predict how your pedals might react from amp to amp, because your pedals may not be able to accept the level of the effects loop. It could clip the effects loop could clip those pedals, in fact. And then there's other ones that are great and have buffered sends on them, which I think is ideal. And if you don't have an amplifier that has a buffer in it, you can always buy something like the Kleinulator, which is essentially a solid state Dumbolator, which is sort of the effects loop that Howard Alexander Dumble had built as an accessory that you could add on to a Dumble amplifier in order to incorporate, at the time, rack gear and wet processing effects after the preamp section, and be able to have it properly kind of matched impedance-wise by way of these buffers. I would highly recommend getting something like that if you don't have an active effects loop where you have some control over the send and return volume, because ideally you want to be able to attenuate that level so that it matches up well with the pedals. And then if you need to bring that level back up as it gets back into the amp to return it back to the original level that it was when it was coming out, you have the ability to adjust, basically have a volume control before it hits the pedals and then a volume control after the pedals, so that you can balance the level equally so that there's not going to be any tone suck, and that it's also going to ensure that you're having a high quality buffered signal that's going to be feeding the pedals. Now, if you use something like a Kleinulator or some sort of buffered effects loop device, that needs to be as close to the amp as possible, because the more capacitance that's seen by a passive effects loop on the send is detrimental to the tone. So I've seen people buy Kleinulators or similar sorts of boxes, and they put them on the pedal board, and they run a 20-foot cable out from the effects send before it hits the buffer. Well, that's not really helping you, because you're still seeing that 20-foot cable before you hit the buffer.
Yeah.
The idea is that the buffer comes before the 20-foot cable that goes back to the amp. And then on the return, as Grant said, you definitely want to have an output buffer there. It's just another output, just the same as the output would be going to the front of the amp. So that needs to be a low output impedance signal, unless you have something that's already really low output impedance, like a Strymon device or something like that has a low output impedance already. You could get away without running a buffer in that case. But if you're running 5-cable method, then you might want to have that isolation that something like a Goodwood audio interfacer would offer in order to ensure that, again, both amps are in the proper polarity, that they're in phase with each other, and that you have some galvanic isolation in the event that you have some sort of ground issue between the two amps.
Yeah.
Love it.
And really, that same technique is really the same for wet dry or wet dry wet. I think the misnomer is that, you know, an interface box or a buffering scheme that would work for 4-cable method is the exact same that would work for wet dry. The only difference is that instead of the effects send, you're using the line out from the line out box to feed the wet effects, and then the wet effects would get another buffer going back to whatever the power amp is. And equally, 5-cable method is the same as wet dry wet. Again, the only difference being that instead of the send coming from the effects loop, the send would be from the line out, and then the stereo outputs that would go to the returns are just going to the stereo power amp. So there's really no difference in terms of the buffering between a wet dry and a 4-cable method buffering and a wet dry wet and a 5-cable method buffering system. They're identical in terms of what they do. It's just where the signal is getting fed from changes.
And how I, just in case any of that, like, totally agree. If any of the language was confusing to anyone listening, I think how I often explain that as well is a lot of guys that I chat to running a wet dry wet rig or a wet dry, which is one amp dedicated to just the overdrives, the dry effects, and another amp or two dedicated to the whole pedal board, dry running into wet. And there's that's a whole nother episode we've done, I think, on how to run wet dry wet rigs. Yeah. But basically you just run all your overdrives and dry effects, then you split your signal. One send goes to an amp for your dry that's only seeing your dry effects. The other side of the split goes into the wet, and then after your wet effects buffer going into either a power amp or how it often is for guys I'm working with, 2 other amps. They'll go to both amp inputs, which could be breaking the rules depending on who you're chatting to, or they'll run amp and cab sims on the wet output only and then go to front of house or into their DAW, whatever it is from there. And so I think it's a great way to run it and has a lot of value, and is honestly, even looking back in the short time I've been building junctions or in the music industry, it's changed so much and gotten so much easier with the gear that is now out there, if you know what to look for, which if you're listening to this podcast, you probably do, because we talk about this stuff all the time. So it is easy to do, and it's not that daunting if you really want to get into it and start experimenting with it. The only thing I would add is if you're going to run any 3-line, not necessarily amp, but 3 lines, 3 sends from your pedal board, you want to start looking into multiple transformers again. One less transformer than the amount of lines you're going to run. So in wet, dry, wet with 3 lines, you want 2 transformers. With stereo, that's 2 amps, 1 transformer, and so on and so forth. A 10 amp rig, you'd want 9 transformers to make sure that you're fully covered on both polarity and isolation to make sure you don't get any ground loops.
Yeah. In a good isolation transformer, if people need that, if you maybe are using, let's say, your Strymon pedals and you don't have a interface box, Lely makes a really good one. Their P-split is really nice. But if you do get an external or standalone isolation transformer, they're typically more effective the closer they are to your amp, not on the pedal board. You want to put them as close to the input of the amplifier as possible. So you'd run, your long cable from a Strymon. It would go into the Lely splitter box that has the isolated output, and then you just run a short cable out of your Lely into the amp input. So you ideally, those are living as close to the amp as possible to get the most effective isolation. 2 small things before we wrap up is wireless units. If you run a wireless, how will that affect sort of everything that we've talked about? We've already kind of talked about impedance sensitive stuff in terms of like fuzzes and things like that, and that the input buffer would come after those. But maybe we could just touch quickly on how a wireless would change the game. I think we've already talked about pedals that already have good buffers in them. We talked about stuff like the Strymons, stuff like the TC electronic tuners that have the bona fide buffer. Really, as long as they have a 1 meg input impedance and 100 ohm output impedance and they're buffered, putting those first or last to substitute for a input or output buffer is perfectly fine. But what about wireless? How does that change it? Who wants to take this first?
I will say my piece really quick because I don't have too much to say on it. I treat a wireless unit typically like an always-on pedal. So it's typically going to be buffering your signal for better or worse. If you're going to run a wireless, you're probably already aware of the fact that you're going to have some, you're already giving up some ground as far as buffer sensitive pedals go. And I was actually going to ask you guys if you have any other hacks around that. Guys that absolutely have to use a wireless, but they love fuzz. What do you tell them to do?
Quit.
That's what I was like. I don't really have a great answer here. I was hoping that you guys would be able to help me out, but that makes me feel a little bit better, at least.
No, there are I mean, there's workarounds. None of them are as great as plugging. Because the reality is that the guitar needs to be seeing those pedals directly because the interactivity of the high impedance, pickups of, a Strat or Les Paul or whatever, your passive pickup is. They have a certain interaction that our ears are accustomed to in terms of the pedal behavior and things like that. And the wireless is a buffer. So if you have a wireless, you don't need an input buffer if you're always using the wireless. If you're going cable on occasion, then you would want to have an input buffer, and you could leave the input buffer there if you did use a wireless. It wouldn't necessarily hurt anything, especially if the quality of the input buffer is good. But there is a fellow countryman of yours, Grant, Mario Marino from Axis Electronics. He makes what's called the unbuffer, which basically takes a low output impedance signal coming from something like a wireless, converts it back to a high impedance signal to go to something like a fuzz or, impedance sensitive device, and then converts it back to a low output impedance signal. So it's a kind of a little box. It's fairly small enclosure, and it's called the unbuffer. And I think he sells them right on his website for Axis Electronics. So I would say you could check that out. There are some fuzz pedals that do work well with low output impedance signals like that of a wireless. The classic fuzz from MXR, which is a small enclosure, it has like a buffered mode on it too, so that it can kind of be optimized for that particular scenario. And I think it's called the classic BC108 fuzz. Those work really great. Also, the Boss FZ series works really great with a wireless, so those could be some options. They aren't going to be as glorious as your vintage fuzz face, but they'll be passable in that scenario.
Love it.
Yeah, I'm on the same boat as you guys when it comes to the wireless. I don't get a lot of people using wirelesses if they have fuzzes, which is actually interesting, and it's for that exact reason. But I would say exactly what you guys said. So you said it perfectly.
Okay. Well, I think that about sums it up as far as mono buffering, stereo buffering, 4 cable, 5 cable, wet, dry, wet, whether you have impedance sensitive pedals, whether you have a wireless, and also pedals that have decent buffers already built in. Again, I think the X factor for all buffers, whether it's input or output, should be a 1 meg input impedance, 100 ohm output impedance is a great place to start. I think you could go up as high as 500 ohms if you needed to. And Boss buffers aren't that great. Klon buffers aren't that great. TLO72, not really a great IC chip for a neutral buffer if that's what you care about. Ideally, a buffer should have no color. And don't make the mistake that Scott made where he believes that an RC booster is somehow not a buffer because he leaves it always on because he hates buffers. So any pedal that's on is a buffer. We've learned that. Buffers have been typecasts. They're the Michael Keaton of all the pedals. They've been typecast as Batman and can't escape it. I think that I think we're in a better place now. I don't know if you guys feel the same, but
I do.
I feel like that was therapeutic.
I feel like my
And,
day can continue.
Yeah. And if those of you who are listening to this and are still confused, you can certainly put a comment in YouTube, and we will certainly get to you. And if you're listening to this on a podcast, an audio-only podcast, you can, of course, head over to our YouTube channel at Vertex Effects, and we'll have all of our episodes listed there. And you also have our contact information of each one of us that's in the show notes on all of the major podcatchers, so you can certainly contact us there if there's specific questions that you have, or just copy all three of us, and one of us will probably answer. So thanks, guys. That was our talk on buffers, and we will see you next week with another riveting discussion on something related to getting you closer to Destination Tone Town.
See you guys.
See ya.
Bye.